All right, so I'm very pleased that we have a guest today, all the way from St. Louis, Dr. James Croft. James is the outreach director for the St. Louis Ethical Society in St. Louis, Missouri. And that is, by the way, a sister society that is a really big sister. They are the largest of the ethical societies in the United States. And it's a really great place, and if you're out that way, I strongly encourage you to check it out and to be part of things there. But before James came here, he also did other things. So he studied education and human development at Cambridge in England, and you'll know when he starts speaking that's where he's from, and also went to Harvard, where he got a master's and a doctorate degree there, and during that time read too much and slept too little. James was raised on William Shakespeare, Carl Sagan, and Star Trek. Currently lives in St. Louis with his fabulous drag queen husband, Colton. So really happy, James, to be here. And I do also hope that you're planning to be here for the afternoon when James does a terrific workshop on persuasion. But for now, let's hear about food for the humanist soul. James, welcome to the lectern.
Thank you so much, Bart. I'd like to thank Bart and Ruth Ann both for their exquisite hospitality while I've been here. It's a real pleasure to visit ethical societies, and particularly when people are so kind and welcoming, so thank you for that. It has been, I think, potentially 5 or 6 years since I came to this society. So it's absolutely wonderful to see you all. Last time I came here, you were gathering and looking that way, in a little corner over there, and I'm very, very glad that you've reversed it again, and I have the benefit of a very grand backdrop. I'm sure it makes me look better. The opening of my platform address today is a little unusual because I'm going to begin with the Bible, particularly Genesis 2, verse 7, when God creates humankind. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. It's a powerful moment. The creation of humankind, of us, is the climax of the Genesis story. And we come into the world when God breathes into us and we become a living soul. At that point in the story, God has created many things. And since I don't want to presume the gender of God, I'm going to use the singular they throughout this presentation. They have created light and darkness, day and night. They have created the sky and the water and the earth. They have created grass and trees and fruit and herbs. They have created the sun and the stars and the moon. They have created fish, whales, birds, cattle, and bugs. But the creation of humanity is special because of all the things that God has made. Only we receive the breath of life. Only we are gifted with a living soul. The idea that human beings have a soul, that there is something special inside us, some ineffable essence which makes humans unique among animals and each individual unique among other human beings, is one of the most ubiquitous and long-lasting beliefs of the human species. Human cultures have believed in the soul for at least thousands of years. This is a stone monument, a stele, which according to the inscription holds the soul of Kutamua, a royal official who lived in the 8th century BCE, 2,800 years ago. It is, I think, the earliest written reference to the idea that a soul can persist after the death of the body which previously housed it. But belief in the soul is certainly much older even than that. Everywhere we look in the world, and in whatever time period we travel to, we find belief in the soul. The idea is commonplace in religions from the Baha'i faith to Zoroastrianism. Even the ancient Greeks, often considered the most rational and scientific of ancient civilizations, had several well-developed theories regarding the soul. Belief in the soul may well be the most pervasive and tenuous single idea that we human beings have ever had about ourselves. This belief is so pervasive, in fact, that despite the highly scientific age in which we now live, most people still believe in the existence of the human soul. A 2005 poll of Americans by Newsweek found that 67% of people believed that a person's soul goes to heaven or hell when they die, 13% that the soul lives in some sort of spiritual realm, and 5% that the soul is reincarnated after our death. So that means, adding that all up, that at least 85% of people polled back then believed in some sort of soul. And even in the UK, where I'm from, which is a much less religious country than the USA, a survey in 2009 found that 70% of people believed in the human soul. But what is a soul? Because the idea of the soul has been found in all over the world throughout all of human history, it would be completely impossible in the time we have this morning to explore all the different ways in which that concept has been understood. But there are some general themes which emerge when we look across time and across religious traditions and cultures. The soul is often understood to be immaterial. It is not made of matter like our body is. It is not something we can see or touch. As one respected spiritual guide once said, "Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter." That was Master Yoda, of course, and the Jedi definitely believe in souls.
Was that luminous beings we are?
No, luminous beings are we, is what he said. Yes, the Jedi definitely believed in souls, and in those Star Wars movies, people actually, Jedi, become blue ghosts after they die, and they can still talk around a campfire and engage with each other. So what is the soul? The first thing is that it is considered to be immaterial. Secondly, the soul is usually considered to be supernatural, beyond the natural world, and often explicitly connected to the divine. In some traditions, the soul is thought to be a piece of God itself, while in others, the soul is God-given. The soul is usually connected to our thoughts and emotions. It is, in many traditions, our intellect, our dreams, our desires, our fears. It is our personality, everything which makes us us. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, speaking of the soul, reads, "It is the innermost aspect of humans, that which is of greatest value in them." So we'll add that to the definition. The soul is often thought to be that which gives the body life. In ancient Greece, in the 5th century, the word most often used to mean alive was empsukos, which literally means ensouled. In many different traditions, our soul is thought to depart the body at death, so it is intrinsically linked to us being alive. And finally, one of the most common ideas associated with the soul is the hope of life after death. In some religious traditions, the soul separates from the body at death and continues to live in some other place, heaven perhaps. In others, the soul is reincarnated in another body, continuing its spiritual journey, even though the physical journey of one body is over. Some believe that the soul continues its existence in this life, and people continue to live as ghosts. And in each of these views, despite their differences, the soul carries some aspects of the person who died into another place, so that that person isn't truly gone. That last feature, perhaps, is one of the primary appeals of the idea of the soul. The idea that something about us might persist after we are dead is very attractive. Will Durant, a historian and philosopher, once wrote, "The hope of another life gives us courage to meet our own death and to bear with the death of our loved ones." The hope of another life. I can sympathize with that hope, certainly now. Some of you may know that my father recently died. This is him and I on a beach in New England just a few years ago. And my father's death has certainly led me to yearn for a life after this one. My father had been ill for a very long time. He'd been fighting cancer for 2 years when I got the call from my mother telling me to come home immediately. And so after hastily booking flights, my then boyfriend, now husband, Colton, and I traveled to the UK together, flying overnight on a Sunday to arrive Monday morning. We drove straight from the airport to the hospital, and I grew increasingly agitated as we circled the parking lot again and again, trying to find a space. In London, we don't have as much space as you have in the USA. And in addition, they were rebuilding part of the hospital at the time, so parking was very scarce, and it took us way too long. My mother, who's not the most patient person at the best of times, was borderline frantic. But we finally parked the car and worked our way through the warren of long, sterile corridors of the hospital to the room where my father was dying. My mother opened the door, and my dad was lying there, lying in a hospital bed, his head and body turned away from me. His hair was grayer than I remembered it being the last time I had seen him back in January of last year. But I couldn't see anything other than that. Then he turned toward me. He didn't look like my father. When I've tried to describe it, words don't really do it justice. He was gaunt, haggard, skeletal. The honest truth is, he looked like the Crypt Keeper. If you haven't seen that show, think of the Living Dead, right? Zombie. He looked so different, like all the life had been sucked out of him. His chin was sharper, his eyes were sunken, his breath was labored. His teeth looked like a skull's teeth, his arms like matchsticks with skin on them, like a gruesome puppet. People had told me he's lost a lot of weight, but that wasn't nearly right. He'd lost almost everything. And for a moment I was afraid that he wouldn't recognize me. But he does, and he tries to smile. He sees Colton, who is crying by now, and I had never seen Colton cry like that before. He lifts his shrunken hands and greets my boyfriend, now my husband, and that is so like my father, genteel to the last. And we try to talk, but he can't really talk because the medicine that he's taking is making his mouth too dry. His deafness, which had been advancing even before the cancer, is now acute. So instead, I write things on a yellow pad of paper, and he scrawls his response. "He makes me very happy," I write. "Good," he squiggles back. At one point, when Colton and my mother have left the room, he fixes me with his eyes, which now look enormous in his gaunt face, and says, "I didn't think I'd be here so quickly. I thought I'd have months." Every word is its own sentence, forced out, weakened lungs. And I don't have anything to say to that. I thought we'd have years, decades even, with each other. I had plans for us, my father and I. Those plans will never be. The next morning, my mum and I drove again to the hospital, and I show my father the ring I'd designed and bought for Colton, and he asks if I've proposed, and I tell him that I'm going to tomorrow. That hadn't been my plan, but I wanted to do it while my father was alive, to give him that happiness. He nods his head and then decides it's time for us to leave. He expresses his desire quite firmly, in a voice stronger than any I've heard from him since we arrived. He tells my mother and I to go away. Then when we take too long to leave, he repeats his directive even more emphatically, "Go away!" Those were the last words my father said to me. I find that darkly amusing. We did go away and began the slow drive home, but halfway through the park, however, I get a call from the hospital, "Get back as soon as possible." My mother asks me to ask the nurse why, though in my mind it's perfectly obvious, and the nurse confirms my fears. "My father is dying. I hope you arrive in time," she says. So we turn round the car and start heading back to the hospital. And this is a tragicomic affair. I give you permission to laugh, even though I know this is awkward. To get back to the hospital, we had to drive through Richmond Park. And that is an area of parkland in London owned by the royal estate. Deer roam in Richmond Park, royal deer, owned by the Queen, literally. And there is an extremely strict, extremely low speed limit, which is enforced ruthlessly. So my mother is driving through the park with great anxiety on her face, a profound feeling of urgency in the car, racing to get to my father's bedside at 20 miles per hour. And when we arrive, we trot through the corridors at a half run to find the door to my father's room closed. The nurses and support staff are conspicuous by their absence. My mother asks what is going on, and a worried-looking nurse tells her that the doctor will be along shortly. But my mother does not wait for the doctor. "F this!" she cries, and storms into my father's room, but she didn't censor herself. My father isn't there. His body is there, small and shrunken on the hospital bed. But he is not. My father is gone. I would love to believe that he hasn't just gone, but that he has gone somewhere. That there is a place where he will continue to run 5Ks in the park and watch quiz shows on television and call out the answers before the question has even been read in full. That there is a place where he is not sick and silent in a hospital bed, but more, as I remember him, always with a book and a glass of red wine. In the difference between my father and my father's body, that is the space where I can understand the need for people to believe in the soul. There is a world of difference between a body and a person, and it is only natural to wonder when we're faced with the death of someone we love, where did all that personality go? If one moment my father was there, and a few minutes later just a body is, but he is not, then it's easy to conclude that we can't just be our bodies. But there must have been something in there animating the body, a ghost in the machine, a soul. And I understand why people want to believe that. because I want to believe that right now. But I do not. I don't believe that human beings have a soul in the sense that we've been talking about today, at least. I don't think that there's an immaterial essence inside of us which makes us go. I hold the contemporary secular scientific view, which has only been developed in the past 100 years or so. And according to this view, we human beings are essentially biological machines. And just as a computer converts electrical signals into a program, our bodies convert biochemical impulses into a person. All the things traditionally thought of to be expressions of the soul, our rationality, our emotions, our personality, are in fact phenomena which emerge from our bodies. With apologies to Master Yoda, we are not luminous beings housed in a material body, but crude matter after all. As the Second Humanist Manifesto put it, modern science discredits such historic concepts as the ghost in the machine and the separable soul. Rather, science affirms that the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. As far as we know, the total personality is a function of the biological organism transacting in a social and cultural context. Rather clinical, perhaps, but I think probably true. And that means I don't believe in an afterlife either. As much as I want to imagine one, I don't think the evidence suggests that another life awaits us after this. Just as it doesn't make sense to ask when you turn off your computer, where did the computer program go? It didn't go anywhere. It just stopped running. I don't think it makes sense to ask, where did my father go after his body shut down? My dad was a program his body was running, a program only his body could run. And now that biological computer has shut off for good, my father will never run again. You see, I think the great religions of the world and the ancient Greek philosophers and every thinker who has asserted the existence of the soul have all made a philosophical mistake, one of the easiest and most tricksy philosophical errors which thinkers are prone to. It is called, in the technical language beloved of we philosophers, the reification fallacy. Reification comes from the Latin res, meaning thing. So this literally means thingification, and fallacy just means a mistake in thinking. So the reification fallacy means simply mistaking an abstract concept for a concrete one, or mistaking an idea for a thing. And I think this is what has happened with the concept of a soul. We observe behaviors in human beings which separate us from the inanimate world and from much of the animal kingdom, like rational thought and emotional engagement and consciousness of our own existence. And we think, there must be something special about these human beings. And we come up with a concept which we call the soul, which really is an abstract idea, a word used to encapsulate certain special features of the human organism. But it's so easy to slip into thinking of that concept as a concrete reality. There must be something special about human beings becomes there must be something special about them. They must have something which other animals do not. We watched our loved ones die and we see the stark difference between a person and a body, and we think something must have gone out of them. Otherwise, how can we explain the enormous difference between before and after death? So now we're thinking of the soul not only as a concept used to describe some of our qualities, but as an independent entity which has real existence on its own. And now the soul can exist without the body, It can journey to the underworld or be reincarnated in another body or go up to heaven. And once we start thinking of the soul that way, it's just another short step until we have people like Duncan McDougall, who in 1907 conducted experiments to try to precisely measure the weight of the soul. He really did this. He put terminally ill patients on scales, and he tried to measure the change in weight at the moment of death due to the soul's departure from the body. And we talked about this last evening. He claimed that a soul weighed, who wants to guess what a soul weighs? He said it was 21 grams. And his findings sparked fierce debate in the New York Times, which reported, "Soul has weight, physician thinks, loss to body recorded." Now, it may seem silly to us to think like this now, but once we started thinking of the soul not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete thing, this is the natural and logical consequence. We will search for the soul everywhere and never find it. So, where does this leave people like me, and I know many ethical humanists who share my conviction, who believe that human beings have no immaterial soul and no hope for a life after this one? Should we discard the idea of the soul entirely? Just jettison it as a useless and discredited idea? It's very tempting to do that. We should try to believe only what is true. And if it's not true that the soul literally exists, then maybe we can get rid of the idea entirely. But I think there's a better way. If all these thinkers and religious leaders have truly been committing the fallacy of reification, making the idea of a soul into a concrete thing to be found and measured, then perhaps we can simply reclaim the concept as the idea it was originally meant to be. Perhaps we can ask, understanding that the soul is not a literal thing, but an idea, well, what does that mean? Well, let's look back at the definition of the soul we made earlier. And let's take out the part that doesn't fit with our modern scientific understanding of the world, the idea that it's something supernatural. What are we left with? The soul is those immaterial qualities of human beings which are of greatest value in us, which give us life, and which enable us to continue to live after our death. I think that can work as a humanist understanding of the soul. We all have immaterial attributes of great value. We all have characteristics of our personality which are unique to us, which comprise our inner selves. We all derive intellectual and emotional sustenance from certain activities. We even sometimes say, "That gave me life." And although we may not continue literally living after death, we all leave a legacy behind us which does continue to affect others. So, is this a way to rescue the idea of the soul from the lure of the supernatural? I think it is. When we say, "That music moved my soul," or "That was a soulful performance," like the one Bart gave earlier, or "That food filled my soul," we don't have to mean anything magic or supernatural by that. We can mean simply that the experience touched us deeply, that it had profound value, that it connected us with those around us and those parts of us which are uniquely ours. It enhanced our life. When we think about the soul of a loved one after they're gone, that doesn't have to be a physical thing that can be weighed or measured or seen. Instead, we can think of what was of greatest value in them, and try to realize that that value is something we can appreciate in our own lives. In that way, we can not only honor their soul, but also take part of it with us. This idea gives me some comfort when I think about my father. His soul didn't fly out of his body while we were driving at a snail's pace through Richmond Park. It isn't waiting for me in a realm beyond reality. But all the things which made him who he was, his love of learning, his impossibly slow running, his passion for wine, his deep, abiding passion for wine, all those things persist in marks his life left in the people who knew him. His soul survives in me and in my family and in his colleagues and friends. Whenever I learn a new useless piece of trivia and think, my dad would have loved that, some part of his soul lights up my mind. Whenever I go for a run in the morning and remember Christmas Day 2 years ago when I went out in the cold and trudged around the park with him, with every step I carry a piece of my father's soul. And whenever I open a bottle of champagne and remember his advice, you shouldn't pop a champagne cork. It's vulgar and draws attention to the fact that you are having champagne. You should open it quietly, like you have it all the time, not noisily, like it's unusual. Whenever I remember that advice, I imagine I hear in the whisper of the cork as it leaves the bottle a sigh from my father's soul. Thank you.